Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are super excited to have this short summer series of presentations by participants of our REACH, the Decisionmakers program. I'd like to first introduce to you our host of the day, James Nolan, who's our co-director of the Community Engagement Corps for the Earth Center. James, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks so much, Alana, and thanks so much for everybody, for being here. I know it's been a roller coaster of a year, and it's also summertime, and really appreciate your continued support. And it's great to see some familiar faces as well as some new ones. As Alana mentioned, this is just one part of a multi-part series talking about the Reach the Decisionmakers program. Today we'll be hearing from the Groundwater Protection League, talking about protecting groundwater from pesticide contamination in California. Next slide, please. For those who aren't familiar with the Reach the Decisionmakers program, this is a year-long program that the Community Engagement Corps at the Earth Center has been running, kind of featuring like a fellowship model with multidisciplinary teams. So we've been really focused on combining scientists, kind of academic researcher groups with community members as well as healthcare providers to have a really kind of multiple perspective composition, all with the intention of informing, promoting science-based health standards to promote health policy that's responsive to public health needs. This program featured both in-person as well as online trainings, mentorship, and collaborations, as well as funds to physically go to Sacramento, have those meetings in person with stakeholders, which we think is really, really valuable. Our fellows include 19 different, academic, physician, community, and much more different kind of folks. Composed of 3 different teams. Team 1 that will be presenting next month. I'll talk about that in a second. Underground Rising really worked on improving policies to account for migrating VOCs with a focus on the Richmond area, as well as outreach to the California Water Board and local communities. Team 2, from whom we'll hear today, the Groundwater Protection League, worked on improving processes for identifying chemicals on the groundwater protection list. And this work included outreach to DPR and WEHA. And Team 3, Hear Us, worked on factoring heat stress into risk assessments for farm worker health. This work included outreach to DPR, WEHA, as well as state legislators and local communities. Accomplishments, continue to roll in. Just because our Reach the Decision Maker cohort is over, doesn't mean the teams have stopped the work, and they're doing all kinds of amazing stuff. We'll highlight something in a moment. But among the things that were already accomplished, we've got 3 policy-focused white papers, more than 5 meetings with agency staff at DPR and the California Water Board and a WEHA, and more than 8 meetings with state legislators, and fellows mobilized to continue the work far beyond this fellowship. Research is ongoing. Some of the teams have been able to secure grants and funds and hire more folks to their teams. Folks have completed op-eds and blogs and comics, community events, public hearings, and 2 nominations to the DPR EJAC, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is a really big deal. So please applaud, albeit silently. And next slide, please. As I mentioned, please save the date for the second in this series. It'll be on August 12th at noon. We'll be hearing from Team 1, Protecting Public Health from Rising Coastal Groundwater, again, with a focus on policies that account for migrating VOCs, especially in the Richmond area, with pressures to kind of develop and build new residences in areas that might be threatened. This team will consist of speakers from Emma Lasky, Christina Hill, and Rainbow Rubin. And next slide, please. Today's speakers, we've got Tien, Jenny, and Jenny. I'll be doing intros with more bios for each of them right now. So kind of prepare yourself. There's lots to discuss. So Tien is a policy manager at the Community Water Center. She focuses on sustainable groundwater management and just land transition. Previously, she was an analyst at the California State Water Resource Control Board, serving 2 board members. As a Senate fellow in Senator Maria Elena Durazo's office, she managed housing and environmental policy. Tien holds a BS in environmental studies from Yale and enjoys reading, fiction, doing puzzles, and karaoke. Jenni Shearston is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's an environmental epidemiologist whose work focuses on identifying and measuring chemical pollution from various sources and their impacts on health. She prioritizes research questions that center community engagement and those that directly inform policy, addressing longstanding health inequities and exposure disparities. Dr. Shearston's current research projects focus on one, the intersection of chemical exposures and menstruation, and two, the health impacts of and distribution of oil, gas, traffic-related pollution, and corresponding state and local regulation to protect health. Jenny Rempel is a member of the Energy Resources Group at UC Berkeley. Jenny studies water governance to understand the patterns and drivers of drinking water disparities in rural and urban communities across the United States. Her research engages questions of water governance, quality, and access using mixed quantitative and qualitative methods. Jenny's recent work analyzes the institutions governing source water and drinking water in California, elucidating key challenges and possibilities for water justice in a changing climate. Through her scholarship, Jenny provides residents, advocates, and decision makers with information needed to strengthen community-based solutions to water injustices. And next slide, please. Before they present, we just wanted to highlight we're particularly proud of every team, of course, equally. But this team has some really amazing kind of updates, and they've had this excellent sign-on letter that's been going around to colleagues as well as all sorts of folks in our network. They've collected signatures for a technical letter to DPR on its updated groundwater protection model. They submitted public comments. So their team members provided comments to the US EPA hearing in May on the EPA's proposed changes to the definition of waters of the United States, or WOTUS. And another team member provided public comments at a Pesticide Contamination Prevention Act subcommittee consultation meeting last fall. We'll go into about 30 to 35 minutes of presentations, and we'll leave some time at the end, hopefully 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So please, of course, listen attentively and kind of write down those questions as we go. And I'll pass the mic to the team.
Thanks so much, James. And I'm just getting the screen share ready. All right, Tien, please start us off.
Yeah, hi everyone. So as James mentioned, our presentation is really focused on groundwater from pesticide contamination in California. And for some of us, this is a very new topic from the people in our group. For others, like we had worked in groundwater, but might not have done pesticides work. So kind of a wide range of different expertise levels, backgrounds, and just like interest in this type of work. Next slide, please. And there's three of us presenting today, but we also worked with three other lovely folks, Mac, Ignacio, and our mentor, Emily. And we've come from a variety of backgrounds of being researchers, community-based organizations, advocacy, and also like public health background as well. And this was all as part of the REACH program. And I guess kind of like one milestone that James mentioned is we submitted our comment letter today. And we'll go into more detail about that. But, just really want to say that we thank the full team, and not everyone's here today, but everyone played a really big part in this type of work. And, we came together as the REACH program, and I think, we're going to continue to see how this groundwater pesticide work gets updated and evolves with Department of Pesticides Regulations process. Next slide. Yeah, so this really came about because as part of one of my roles at Community Water Center is to manage our drinking water tool. And this is basically a screening tool to see if different communities that rely on groundwater across the state are potentially vulnerable to certain groundwater challenges such as drought, contamination, and other emerging drinking water threats such as PFAS and pesticides. And I had done a webinar, and staff from Department of Pesticides Regulation reached out to us to learn more about our pesticide PFAS methodology and how we were kind of deciding how different pesticides were being prioritized and being displayed in the drinking water tool. And so from that project, they shared that, hey, there's this regulatory process that's coming up. And so I was like, this is cool. This is something like new that I've, just kind of learning about. And this is also kind of the first time that they're updating this methodology. So this coincided with the REACH program starting, and I was like, okay, let's see like if that we can make this happen and we can partner with different people and see if we can, have like a little bit of an advocacy campaign around it. And the main focus really is to protect drinking water, to really highlight environmental justice concerns, especially in agricultural rural areas that are predominantly Latinx and farm worker communities, and predominantly low income too. Next slide, please. So just as a primer for what groundwater is the water that we have under the ground, that a lot of communities across California pump and use as a vital source for drinking water, also used for agriculture, especially in the San Joaquin Valley and the Central Coast. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that there's certain patterns of groundwater pumping and also groundwater contamination that's happening, and it's really affecting people's health um, and their quality of life, right? So folks that are facing this, where they have a dry well or a contaminated well, or even if they're connected to a water system, if they don't trust the water that's coming out of their tap, they have to make daily decisions on how they can get safe water. So whether that's hauling, tanks of water, whether that's buying bottled water and, making sure that you have, the money to do that, because, this is not like having to pay a water bill and also buying bottled water is very expensive. So these are kind of like the daily concerns and issues that community residents are facing, and trying to make sure that their family is safe, that their community is safe, and that at the same time knowing that this is a systemic issue. So how can we address this through different regulatory programs? How can we do community organizing around that? Look at legislative pathways and other approaches to highlighting this problem and finding solutions. Next slide. Yeah, so especially in these agricultural communities where pesticides are sprayed, fertilizers are being used, there's a lot of pesticides that are being leached into the groundwater and potentially contaminating drinking water sources. There's also potential for it to volatilize and go into the air and also go into surface water through runoff. But our focus really is on pesticides and groundwater for today. And it's a huge concern because, there's a lot of significant potential adverse health effects, such as birth outcomes, cancer risks, neurodevelopmental and behavioral deficits, reproductive harm, and neurotoxicity. And I think it's like for a resident who, is exposed to this for decades and then is also trying to raise a family, there's just a lot of concerns about, like, is this safe for my family? Is this safe for my community? And how can we address this? Next slide, Pete, please. There's also emerging research led by Donnelly showing that pesticides are sources of PFAS, and that it's going into our food, it's going into our gardens, and ultimately we're consuming that through consuming food and drinking water contaminated with pesticides. And there's been research showing that there's been leaching from the bottles that are in the pesticides that are used to be sprayed on the crops. And that, there's a lot of also pesticides in, for example, like things that people use in their gardens or like flea treatments and things that we put on ourselves and, on our pets too. So multiple sources of PFAS contamination related to pesticides. And then in particular for rural communities who depend on groundwater for their drinking water, drinking, PFAS contaminated water is a huge concern. Next slide. And we, are just talking about pesticides, but it's very well documented that communities are facing multiple contaminants. They're facing nitrates, arsenic, hexavalent chromium, 1,2,3-TCP. And the cumulative exposure, so the overall impacts of being exposed to that over a long period of time can lead to really adverse health outcomes. But unfortunately, the way that we regulate contaminants and constituents is usually just one chemical at a time, which is not accounting for the fact that communities and environmental justice communities are facing a whole mixture of contaminants over a long period of time. And in addition to, additional social stressors, such as thinking about, the fact that infrastructure is not built out for communities of color and they're living in unincorporated communities, it just contributes to these environmental injustices that we're seeing in California even to this day. And next slide. And when I say like communities, like these are the communities I'm really talking about. It's Community Water Center works closely with our Agua Coalition, which is a group of residents and community leaders who represent over 30 communities, and 11 community-based organizations are also a part of this. And we really focus on Tulare County area and parts of Fresno County, and then Monterey County and parts of Santa Cruz County. But we're seeing that, in these agricultural spaces, there's a lot of the same dynamics of industrial agriculture contributing to overpumping of groundwater, contributing to water quality contamination. And how can we organize and educate community partners so that they can provide recommendations directly to state and local decision makers to protect their drinking water? Next slide. And Mac is an analyst at the Clean Water Action and works closely with the Gomite in Lost Hills. And this is a community group based out of the Kern County area. And they do a lot of work on drinking water advocacy, oil and gas, and exposure to toxic chemicals. And, very much have been tracking their groundwater plans and management actions that are happening. So, in terms of like why this research is important, why this like regulatory process is important, is because we know that the communities that are most burdened are the ones that are facing all these different environmental and health issues and are disproportionately impacted by these issues, and that this has been a long-standing historical concern. And, it's time for us to really undo those structural barriers and make sure that everyone has access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. Okay, next slide. Okay, so going to, the structure of how pesticides are regulated in groundwater. So the Department of Pesticide Regulation looks at monitoring and pesticides, not just in groundwater, but also in air, surface water, soil types. And they do have a specified program for their groundwater monitoring. And their program is really focused on monitoring and then also trying to better understand if they can predict whether a pesticide pesticide will leach into the groundwater or not. And this is looking at active ingredients and also their degradates. And they create this list called the Groundwater Protection List to help identify and figure out what is the criteria for pesticides leaching into groundwater and then leading to those adverse health outcomes and exposures to contaminated water. And I'll pass it to Jenny to really just jump into that whole methodology and process.
Thanks, Tien. Can everyone hear me okay? Or Tien, if you can let me know if you can hear me.
Yes, thumbs up.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Okay, so as Tien described earlier in the beginning of the presentation, DPR, the Department of Pesticide Regulation, I'll call it DPR moving forward, has been working on this new statistical method for identifying which pesticides are likely to leach into groundwater. And then those pesticides that they identify as the likely leaching pesticides go on the groundwater protection list. And so when we first began this REACH project, Tien shared with us this information and was talking about this new update and her conversations with DPR previously. And in October, DPR finally released their new study, which was really awesome. It's very long, it's very detailed. This is a screenshot here on the left of that study if you're interested in digging more into it. And so we decided that we wanted to focus our project around kind of responding to this new method. So how does DPR determine which pesticides leach into groundwater and therefore should be on the groundwater protection list? They kind of use a three-part process to do this. And the first is measuring pesticides in groundwater. So DPR tests groundwater for a variety of agriculturally used pesticides. They do this pretty regularly and have some data sets where this data is actually published and available. Here's a screenshot of one of those reports. So then using this data, these measurements of pesticides in groundwater, they classify pesticides as either a leaching pesticide or a non-leaching pesticide. So essentially, if a pesticide is detected in groundwater after agricultural application, and I am oversimplifying a little bit, but generally, it's considered a leaching pesticide. And if it's not detected in groundwater, despite testing for its presence, it's classified as a non-leaching pesticide. So we end up with kind of this group of pesticides that are leaching and non-leaching. And then DPR identifies cutoffs for pesticide physical chemical properties that help them differentiate and predict whether or not a new pesticide is going to be a leaching pesticide or a non-leaching pesticide. So basically they gather data on many different physical chemical properties of pesticides, and they compare those in the leaching category, this kind of blue bell curve, if you will, to those in the red category, the non-leaching bell curve. And they're kind of trying to compare, well, what is the characteristic of these pesticides? How is it different between these two categories? So when the groundwater protection list was first developed back in 1991, the law was actually very specific and specified that the way a pesticide would be identified as a leacher or not had to be through 5 specific physical chemical properties. And these were classified as the specific numeric values, and they're here on the left side of your screen. So if you do any work with pesticides, some of these may be familiar to you. They're things like water solubility, soil absorption coefficient, and a number of different kinds of half-lives. And so this old method really had just 5 kind of stagnant values of which a pesticide could be above or below, and these were used to determine if a pesticide was likely to leach or not leach. So again, last year, DPR published a method that they had been working on to kind of revise this old, fairly simple method of predicting whether or not a pesticide would leach. And so now they've determined this multivariate method. I've copied this formula here. I won't go into detail about it, but you can see that it is a lot more complicated than the kind of one by one compare a pesticide to every single value. Some of the same physical chemical properties are present here. So we still have soil aerobic half-life and soil absorption coefficient. There's also some new physical chemical characteristics that weren't included previously, like dipole moment or energy of highest occupied molecular orbital. So this is above my level of expertise here, but a lot of physical chemistry kind of quantities about the different pesticides. So this new method is a substantial improvement from the prior method at predicting whether or not a pesticide is likely to leach into groundwater and therefore whether or not it should be included on the groundwater protection list. Some of the reasons this method is an improvement is because it's multivariate. So rather than looking at physical chemical properties one at a time, they're all now being combined together. You have different multiplication factors assigned to them. This is more realistic. This new statistical model was built with a much larger data set that was used to determine leaching and non-leaching pesticides. So it's describing that DPR measures pesticides in groundwater frequently, and they have this large data set that they classify pesticides as leaching and non-leaching. So when that first method was developed back in 1991, that data set was a lot smaller. But now, of course, it's been 34 years. So much more data was able to be used to really decide what to really classify pesticides into these leaching and non-leaching categories. The new method incorporates additional pesticide properties like dipole moment, and I will say they actually looked at tens of different physical chemical properties and used some fairly complex statistical methods to decide which of those would be used in their model. Very importantly, the new model evaluates pesticide degradates. This is due to a change in the law that authorizes DPR to actually do this work that now includes pesticide degradates. That's really important because some main ingredients actually can decay very quickly into other degradates, but those degradates themselves still find their way, unfortunately, into groundwater and can have health impacts. And finally, DPR conducted extensive internal validation to determine which statistical method works best on their data to predict whether or not a pesticide is likely to leach. And again, I would encourage you to review this study here on the left if you're interested in learning more. They really there's extensive documentation there about these different validation steps and statistical methods used to kind of come up with that final result. So our overarching goal as part of the REACH team was to inform the development of these updated regulations, this updated method stipulating how pesticides are being added to the groundwater protection list. And we wanted to make recommendations that really prioritize drinking water and community needs, like Tien was describing earlier in the background. And so we focused on this. And I'll give you just a brief and simplified overview of the process that we used and the recommendations that we came up with and that are included in the public comment letter that we just submitted today to DPR. So first, we'll start with October 18th when DPR released this new method that I've just been talking about for identifying leachable pesticides. And shortly after that, on October 25th, our team met with DPR and actually was able to talk with them about this new method. And so it was really helpful to get a feel from them for how this process of kind of creating this new method and putting it out to get public comment and putting it into place, what that timeline was going to look like, what kind of hearings were going to happen, and what opportunities might be available for us to comment or to work with DPR. So it was very helpful to kind of set our expectations and to set our timeline. And so it's also a great meeting to get some input and information about some of the decisions that DPR had made in determining what their new method would be. For example, they chose to focus on pesticide detection data in groundwater from the state of California only instead of from the entire United States. And so we were able to ask about that. And it asked why DPR had made that decision, for example, and they have specific reasons for it related to data quality and making sure that pesticides pesticide detections were the result of agricultural use. But it was really helpful to be able to have these conversations. We then attended a public hearing on the Pesticide Contamination Prevention Act, where DPR was presenting this new method to the public and to other agencies, to WEHA and to SWRCB. And so Jenny and I attended virtually, and Tien attended in person. And this was incredibly helpful, again, to get to hear the scientists from DPR have been working on this project for a long time to actually share all these results and kind of walk everybody through the different methods. And Tien, you're I think the only person actually who attended in person at all. Was there anything that stood out to you that you wanted to share from that experience?
Yeah, it was I think the meeting was 8:30 on a Monday. I was the only one there in person. So I think it's just I made comments about the importance of public process and like this is a super technical, wonky, regulatory document, but not a lot of people know about it, even though it does affect and will affect thousands of communities in California. And so I just made like general comments of like, really, really looking forward to continuing to engage with you and hopefully that there's more opportunities for public comment. And I think like even if it is just one person showing up, like that's important because I think sometimes state agencies don't really like think about, okay, like, yeah, what are the actual human impacts of this decision and like who are the people that would be interested in knowing about this update?
Awesome. Thank you. So shortly after this hearing, we met with WEHA, and we were really interested in learning what WEHA's role was in this kind of process of revising this method and the groundwater protection list itself. And so this was very helpful. And we were really interested in thinking about how can we get health kind of incorporated really explicitly into this method. For example, thinking about the neurologic toxicity of a pesticide and whether or not that could be considered. And so this was a very helpful meeting for us to have a conversation with WEHA and start to feel that out. Although what we really learned was that WEHA wasn't really involved in this part of the process, and that their only involvement was really this hearing that Tien was just sharing about. So that was a little frustrating and interesting, and it was good for us to learn what this like bureaucratic process actually looked like and who was responsible or even had the authority to be weighing in on this particular problem. And then we decided to chat with some experts in pesticide leaching. It's very complicated to predict whether or not a pesticide is likely to leach into groundwater because you have characteristics about the pesticides, about its application, about the soil itself, about how water is being applied to the field, and all of these things can contribute to the likelihood of pesticide leaching or not leaching. So we wanted to get some more technical information so that we could make scientifically sound comments. And finally, on March 20th, we met again, this time in person in Sacramento with DPR. And here we were able to share a white paper we had spent the prior few months developing and lay out some specific recommendations that we had for this new statistical method. And these are the recommendations that we included in the comment letter that we just submitted. So it was great to be able to share these with DPR and to get their thoughts on them. So we really learned about WEHA's limited role in groundwater monitoring and that the agencies aren't really working together on this particular specific topic. We learned about the structure of DPR's Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is kind of just beginning to get going, and which DPR seemed very interested in working with as well. Although they are still currently, I'm not sure if they finished identifying who all the members of the committee will be or if that's still in the process, but that was what was happening at the time in March. We spoke about cumulative exposures and how DPR is thinking about them. Right now, the way the law and the method is structured, pesticides are being evaluated one at a time rather than in a cumulative manner. But it was good to hear how DPR is beginning to address this issue and how they're thinking about it. And finally, we talked about the data selection process for the new model, and we actually provided some recommendations for additional pesticides that DPR could use to validate their model that was not used in its building. So again, we identified 4 policy recommendations. One of them was that the department should conduct additional validation of the new method. And what we meant by this specifically was that DPR had used, again, those measurements of pesticides that they detect in groundwater to identify leaching and non-leaching pesticides. And they used 42 of those pesticides to develop this new statistical model. But of course, way more than 42 pesticides are being applied in California and across the United States. And so one thing we wanted to know is how well this new statistical model would perform at predicting groundwater leaching for pesticides that weren't included in this list of 42 that were used to build the model. And so to facilitate this, we identified many different pesticides that we felt the department could consider to do this kind of validation, which would build additional kind of support for and confidence in this model. 2, we recommend that the department regularly update the base data that's actually used to build its statistical model, and that's used to identify pesticides that should be included on the groundwater protection list. This list and this method hadn't been updated since it was initially put into use in 1991. So it's been 34 years. And as you can imagine, many different pesticides and wells have been tested in the meantime. So being able to incorporate this new data on a much more frequent basis is really important because it helps make sure that the model and therefore this list is as updated as it can be. 3, we recommended that the department prioritize active ingredients and degradates of pesticides that are major sources of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. As Tien introduced at the beginning, PFAS are really this emerging class of chemicals of concern that are tied to a number of different harmful health outcomes, but they're also very long lasting in the environment. And so it's really important that we be preventative about making sure these chemicals aren't getting into groundwater. And 4th, we encourage the department to examine cumulative exposures and the synergistic impacts of pesticides in groundwater, because again, people aren't exposed to one pesticide at a time. They're exposed to a whole number of them, not only through the drinking water they might consume, but also through their foods, through the air, through the soil, and through their work. And with that, I want to pass off to Jenny Rempel to wrap us up.
Thanks, Jenny. I will jump into some reflections and next steps to close us out. So you can go to the next slide. And I'll start off by sharing 3 successes for our team from our broader Reach the Decision Makers experience. First, if you click Jenny, the project was really an opportunity to collaborate with a diverse team. We had a medical professional, a research scientist, environmental epidemiologist, environmental policy scholar, water policy and environmental justice advocates, and our mentor, an environmental scientist at an advocacy organization. So our team really appreciated the chance to learn from and with one another as we all embarked on this project that was quite a big learning experience. And second, if you click Jenny, our project was an opportunity for us to build relationships not only with our own team members and REACH program staff and participants, but also with key agency staff at DPR and OEHA. Much of our team's background and prior experience had really been related to water, and we appreciated building these relationships and getting to have several meetings with the folks developing the groundwater protection list. And because there are multiple divisions and multiple agencies even involved in aspects of how we regulate pesticides in groundwater, this was a really big learning opportunity, which brings me to my third point, which is that the project was an opportunity for each of us to learn more about the science and current policies related to pesticides in groundwater. So this was a new focal area for all of us, and we really got to dive into the literature on pesticides and health, on cumulative exposures, pesticide regulation, pesticide leaching, and PFAS, among other topics. And we also learned a lot about how DPR operates, including really its processes for continuous evaluation of pesticides. And if you go to the next slide, I will touch on just 2 challenges that we encountered as part of our REACH experience this year. First, with respect to bureaucracy, we really appreciated that the program started off with the Cal EPA overview from Gina Solomon. And even with that great overview, because our team didn't have much experience working with DPR, it took us a little while to understand how different roles and responsibilities of DPR's multiple divisions and branches work, as well as the roles that other agencies play in regulating pesticides in groundwater, like the State Board and OEHA. As I think Jenny and Tien alluded to a little bit too, even from our meetings with DPR's environmental monitoring branch, for example, we learned that some of our recommendations regarding cumulative exposures and synergistic impacts are relevant not only to that environmental monitoring branch, but also to the human health assessment branch. And we really appreciated input from the REACH community and from our staff contacts at DPR and OEHA as we navigated this bureaucracy. And our second challenge was with respect to timing. Regulatory processes at state agencies can be lengthy. And if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Tien and Jenny, but I think we thought the updated method would be announced before we even began the REACH program over a year ago, and it wasn't announced until October, as Jenny shared, such that we're actually really excited to submit the comment letter today, a bit after the REACH program is formally ended. So it is just a lengthy process for these decisions to be made, and we really appreciate that we were able to see this through. Overall, though, I think even with those challenges, we're really proud to have learned a lot and been able to inform this DPR regulatory process to ensure we protect groundwater and human health. If you go to the next slide, I'll just close with a couple of opportunities and updates. As folks have referenced earlier on this call, DPR just finished receiving nominations for its first Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, or EJAC, that will work to ensure inclusive decision-making processes and equitable impacts for communities impacted by pest management decisions. And those public EJAC meetings, as I understand it, will really be an opportunity to provide public input. So be on the lookout for those meetings, which will likely start later this year. Second, I want to highlight that for residents with domestic wells in California, so household groundwater wells, DPR is offering free at-home well testing kits. That data is obviously both useful for residents, for households, and it is also included in DPR's groundwater sampling data sets to inform regulatory actions. And then finally, we're really proud to submit our comment letter on the updated groundwater protection list and methodology today. We've shared the letter really widely, including with the UCSF Earth Center and our other REACH program participants, and are pleased to have 28 signatures on our letter to DPR. So thank you to everyone on the call who signed on to the letter. We really appreciate that. And overall, we're hopeful that our participation will improve DPR's groundwater protection list to ensure we protect groundwater, drinking water, and human health. And so with that, I'll just say another thank you to the REACH program for an excellent program experience. And thank you to all of you on the call for joining us today. And we can go to the last slide with our contact info. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm sure everyone on the team would be happy to hear your feedback and thoughts. But I think we have a little time for discussion and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for such an informative and fascinating presentation. Covered a lot of ground there. So maybe we'll wrap it here. Thanks so much, everybody, for all your awesome work, and everybody in attendance. Such an amazing project for this team to have been working on, and so glad we got to hear from them. Just absolutely blown away by all that's already been done, and really looking forward to what comes next. And yeah, please do stay in touch. We'll be building a REACH alumni network, and also, as mentioned, we've got our Earth public-facing newsletter. So please subscribe and stay tuned. And we'll see many of you, if not all of you, hopefully at the next REACH webinar on the 12th of August, I believe. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks all.